What rough beast it's our come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Je dis ce que je pense et je vis comme je veux. Je gagne beaucoup d'argent, mais quand j'en avais peu, je n'étais pas plus malheureux. Oui, mais
Hello and welcome to What Rough Beast. I'm Virginia Heffernan. What Rough Beast is the show where we take the measure of America's demise. We don't pretend it's not in demise, in decline. We take the measure of America's demise and try to sort out what might be built from the rubble. One of the ways that America is clearly falling apart is in its foreign policy, in its stature in the world, in its commitment to what used to be called national security, now seems to be White House-based bloodlust. We're going to talk about foreign policy for the first time, I think, or one of the first times on this show. My guest is Fred Kaplan. He is a friend of mine from Slate, and I just recently ran into him at a reading of A Christmas Carol in Manhattan, a happy break from politics, and we tried to take the subway home together with a bunch of friends, and we ended up waiting for hours, not hours, but it felt like hours on the platform for the F train. This is kind of boring, but it was in that wait that we started talking, particularly about Venezuela and the so-called double tap. This is yet another bit of adventuring of military bellicosity from our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who seems to have outdone himself with illegal orders, lawful orders, in, resulting in all kinds of destruction and death. This is alarming in every way, but it's not just alarming because it's another Trump flex, like what he just did with the extraordinarily disrespectful tweet about Rob Reiner. This is the kind of thing that has cascading consequences, deaths, destruction, but also the end, I think, of the Pax Americana, which was the loose idea that America was a kind of peacekeeper in the world and democratic beacon for other countries, and that we gave support, aid, and comfort to other democratic allies, and we tried our best to support resistance to dictators. Now, obviously, all of this went wrong in many, many ways, but it was a role nonetheless that the U.S. was expected to play after the Second World War. Now, we rarely return to the idea in discourse about American foreign policy around Israel, around Ukraine, and now around South America, or even around Trump's efforts to broaden the American empire to annex Canada or, take over Greenland. We rarely talk about what was meant to be a kind of moral role that the United States was supposed to have. But nonetheless, it's worth talking about. Sometimes you only understand something when it's time to say goodbye. Surely that's like a lyric from a pop song. But just as the Pax Americana is crumbling, I really wanted to talk to Fred about what it might mean and also get some clarity on what's happening in Venezuela. So Fred Kaplan is the national security columnist for Slate, longtime Slatester. He's published 7 books, including The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of the Nuclear War, The Insurgents, about David Petraeus, that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and also his most recent book is A Capital Calamity, which is a thriller satire and well worth reading. I am so happy to welcome Fred to What Rough Beast. Fred, hello, and welcome to What Rough Beast.
Thanks for inviting me.
We were joking before we started bitterly joking about whether we might, before this airs, be in some kind of intergalactic war. And it occurred to me to ask you, so are we at war? What is going on in the world? And, you can point to Ukraine. I know you do it all. You can point to Ukraine, you can point to Israel, but focus on Venezuela because that feels like the hottest and most alarming.
Well, it's interesting. Trump announced today that he was imposing a total blockade on Venezuela, but then he changed it a bit to a total blockade on sanctioned oil coming in, sanctioned tankers going in and out of Venezuela. If it was a total blockade, that would be at war. That's an act of war. But blockade on specific things, I mean, it depends. It's kind of odd because the whole thing about Venezuela and the way it treats oil exports and imports is that they have this kind of dark fleet. They false flag tankers, so you can't tell where they're coming from. They emit phony radar emissions, so people tracking them don't quite know where the tankers are. There's no way that you can tell whether a tanker coming into a port is sanctioned or not just by looking at it, especially under those circumstances. So it's unclear really what this means or how it goes on. And then he said something very strange, which I actually had to look up because I had no idea what he was talking about. He says, we're going to keep this up until Venezuela returns all the land, oil, and assets that it has stolen from us. And I'm thinking, what is
Yeah.
going on? And in 2007, there was a legal case with Conoco Oil. Venezuela was expropriating, nationalizing oil that they were investing in Venezuela, and they've kept doing so. And there was a big legal case, and it was never settled. So that must be what he's thinking of, because there's nothing else. There's no land, there's no assets, but also this was a case against a private corporation. So is now Trump saying that we're going to impose blockades and other kinds of political military threats in defense of an oil company and its lawsuit that's been going on for 20 years? I mean, it's all very strange. It's all very strange. But probably it couldn't be said that we are quite at war with them right now. It's not a total blockade. So that's not terribly
So
reassuring,
what?
but it's unclear what he obviously wants Maduro out. He wants to pressure Maduro. By making these moves, though, of course, he's weakening the opposition inside Venezuela. He's strengthening Maduro's image among the military, which is keeping him in power, because anybody who's now criticizing Maduro, whether from the left, right, or center, that can be accused of being an agent of the empire from the north. So it's to do all this in such a high-profile, vocal way. It resembles theater more than any kind of sensible policy, even if you agreed with what the ends of his policy might be.
Yeah. I mean, if he were a guy ranting on the street, we would not obviously take this seriously, but it's maddening over and over again for it to fall to us to make meaning of these pronouncements and fall to the other countries and people that are his targets. So
Right.
does Venezuela, what's your understanding of the internal politics or the internal response to Trump's raving?
Well, I mean, look, it's a horrible government. It's worth overthrowing in some ways. Maduro, he was thrown out of power in an election. He seized power in a coup. He's a brutal dictator. He's completely messed up the economy. I mean, Venezuela has some of the richest oil reserves in the world, and yet it's putting out very little oil, which is what the whole economy depends on, because everything is so messed up. So politically, economically, in every which way, Venezuela's a mess. And what you don't do is do what Trump is doing, especially if it's unclear whether he's going to get serious about it. I mean, I remember, for example, back during George W. Bush, his Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, announced that the budget would include $75 million for assisting democratic opposition movements in Iran. As a result of which, Democratic opposition members started getting rounded up, arrested, and tortured in Iran because they were
Foreign
accused
agents.
of
Yeah.
being CIA agents.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, y-
It's interesting. There's a little of this happening in elections in the U.S. where the money of billionaires is increasingly becoming, or at least in some elections, becoming the kiss of death. That you're a corporate stooge if you take a lot of money. This definitely happened with Cuomo, and so you're right that with friends like those, who needs enemies? And if that's happening in Venezuela, where people look like tools of the imperial overlords
yeah.
who oppose Maduro, you're right that that would lead him to gain some strength.
But also, what is this going to lead to? I mean, Trump said a couple of months ago that he was authorizing CIA covert operations in Venezuela.
Hmm.
Announcing it sort of takes the C out of covert, right? I mean, it becomes overt. What's the point? He keeps talking about maybe doing land operations, but I mean, look at a map. Venezuela's like 1,500 miles from the United States. We don't have any allied military bases near Venezuela that would permit us to use it as a landing stage for an invasion. It's not really very susceptible to going in by sea either. Are we going to start bombing them? And what do you bomb? I mean, even if you agreed with of Trump's policy here, that is to pressure Maduro out
Hmm.
of power. How is what he's doing really leading to this in any systematic way? It's
Yeah.
just, it's a little mad, basically.
Yeah. So, I would simply say this was another case of him trying to menace Canada or Greenland. It's not feasible, that it's laughable, it can become the butt of jokes. And we laugh it off, nervously laugh it off,
I
except that people are dying in Venezuela, not just because Maduro, has put everyone on the famous Maduro diet where he consumes steak in front of everyone while if anyone has any question what runaway hyperinflation really looks like on the bodies of people, I think
Yeah,
weight
yeah.
loss is an average
Well,
of
that's the
19 to
thing.
26 pounds for Venezuelans. And that's been ongoing. That's been ongoing. And now we have
Right.
these threats that look like an oil grab. I mean,
Well
maybe
before
they're
Trump.
about
Well
deposing a
before Trump,
dictator.
by the way. That's been going on in Venezuela.
Right, right. So maybe he benevolently or is acting like he wants to depose a dictator and making trouble by leading to yet another idea that there are clandestine ops or there's possibly, the threat of actual war there. But there's also the internal disaster that the country is, and B, ships actually being targeted and people dying in these Pete Hegseth displays of not just ego but bloodthirstiness. And what do you make of that?
It's a little bit separate, but yeah, it's also kind of crazy. So, okay, so there have been about 25 of these attacks on ships, killing about 95 people since September. The rationale initially was that these boats are bringing illicit narcotics, so therefore the people doing it are narco terrorists. They're bringing it to the United States.
Hmm.
First of all, these are speedboats with about a 50-mile range, and they're 1,000 miles away from the United States. So this is unlikely. They're probably bringing cocaine to Trinidad, and then from where it will be boarded for ships going to Europe. But anyway, these are bad guys, assuming they are carrying drugs, which has never really been proved. But let's say they are. So yeah, so these are bad guys. But we're not at war with them. It's not a legitimate military target. The head of Southern Command, which is the combatant unit that operates in South America on the U.S. military, he either resigned or was fired. It's unclear which, because he objected to this program because it was illegal. And that's why it was put in the hands of Special Operations, which is also supposed to follow international law. But, there are some gray and black areas with Special Operations Command.
Yep.
But
Especially in South America, right? I mean,
yeah,
the
well, yeah,
history of
for
our,
decades,
yeah.
for a long, long time, but anywhere. So, so it's a hard to say that they really pose a military threat. I mean, let's say, Trump has said each boat that is sunk saves 25,000 American lives that would have been killed by fentanyl. But I mean, this is just ludicrous. About 80,000 Americans die from fentanyl and other drugs like that a year. So does that mean that if you sink 3 of these boats, the threat is over? No,
Mhm.
we've sunk 25 and the threat is not over. That's
Yeah.
because they're not coming from these boats. They're coming from overland in Mexico, or they're coming from China or whatever. This has very little to do with anything.
This would just be academic, except that he trots out this
Yeah.
50,000 all the time to justify the coming of these speedboats that we don't know at all as themselves acts of war, up
Yeah.
to and including naming fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah,
Fentanyl, which is used by hospitals.
which is crazy. I mean, let's say there are 2 points to make here. Well, more than 2, but I'll make 2 for the moment. One, let's say that somebody was selling fentanyl on a street corner in Philadelphia, and he was spotted doing so by a cop, by an FBI, by ICE, by the military, whatever. That law enforcement person doesn't have any right to shoot the guy right there on the spot.
Right.
Okay. And there you can actually make a direct link between the guy providing the drugs and
Mhm.
somebody, an American, perhaps dying from it later.
Mhm.
Another point along the same lines, about a week after the first of these attacks on a boat, the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, seized the largest amount of drugs that it had ever seized in its history in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific. I mean, something like, I have the number right here, in fact, 76,000 pounds, which has a street value of $500 million and 23
Wow.
million lethal doses. Okay, they did this the usual way by spotting the ship, sounding the alarm, boarding the ship, not shooting anybody unless the people on board the ship shot first, arresting them, seizing the drugs. They have done in the most recent year. Again, I'm consulting my notes on this, so I'm not just making this up.
Mhm.
In 2022, they seized 100 tons of this stuff. So, I mean, the point is, this is the way it's usually done, and it's pretty effective.
Mhm.
And you get more stuff than just shooting some random speedboat out in the middle of the Caribbean. So we have ways of doing this that
Mhm.
don't involve just killing people. Now, the other thing that Hegseth got in trouble with was the time that they came back for a second time and shot the 2 survivors of
Right.
an
The
attack.
so-called double
The
tap.
first boat attack.
Can you explain that just for listeners? Because so much is getting lost, of course,
Yeah.
in the
So
news
it
cycle.
turned out, and we didn't know this until later, that in the first attack, which killed 11 people, and that Hegseth made a big deal about, we sunk 11 narco terrorists at the bottom of the ocean. This will happen again to anybody who does this. So it turns out that, in fact, after the first attack, there were 2 guys from the boat who survived the attack, and they were kind of hanging on to the overturned boat and waving to the sky, and then the planes came back and shot them as well. First, this was denied. Then it was said, well, we weren't aiming to kill them, but just trying to sink the boat because the marauders could come back and capture the drugs that were in the boat. Just nonsense. Here's the thing about that. What makes that so particularly repellent, especially people in the military? Even if you
Mhm.
accept all the basic premises that Trump and Hegseth have put forth about these attacks, that it is a threat to the United States, that this is the equivalent of terrorism like Al Qaeda. I mean, again, no basis, but let's assume, even assuming their premises, it is clear in every article of law of war and international law and U.S. law and Department of Defense regulations that going back and shooting somebody who's out of the fight is just wrong. There is a passage in the Defense Department regulations on this where they talk about clearly unlawful attacks. In the section where they say that if you're a soldier, you do carry out unlawful orders. So
Yeah.
this section was called clearly unlawful orders because it was accepting the possibility that some of these things are ambiguous.
Mhm.
You're a sergeant, you get an order from a colonel, a captain, whatever. You're not schooled you're schooled to obey orders. Am I really
Mhm.
going to take the chance that this is a lawful order and that I'm going to
Right.
get
Yep.
court-martialed for not? It said, okay, let's parse this. What is a clearly unlawful order? And the clearly unlawful order that the Defense Department regulation on this specified was, for example, shooting someone in a shipwreck, even if it was an enemy boat that was in shipwreck.
Wow.
And somebody
I had no idea. That's
yeah,
such
that
an
is
astonishing detail. Is that
the
the
example.
sole it's
Obviously,
the
this is
sole
clearly,
example?
that's
That's
the
the
sole
sole
example.
example. Wow.
Yep.
Were they
You can look it
expected
up.
by analogy to know that other things were clear, people being out of the fight, or this is the
Yeah,
only
that's
one?
the idea. Out of the fight, and then, for example, somebody who survived a shipwreck. I mean, it says that specifically. So
So,
there's
is
really
there
no
any
excuse for
evidence
this.
Is there any evidence that anyone said, let's not do this? Or has the military been so gutted of people who would talk back and so filled, at least the brass, with
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, retired people have said so, retired military lawyers in particular.
people out of the fight have said it?
There are, it's interesting. I've in fact even asked some very high level retired military people, how come people aren't speaking out about this? Not just this, but other things that have been
Yeah.
going on. And I haven't been getting much response. And I think there are two things. First, there is this ethos in the American military to not get involved in politics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and this is a good thing. So I think even though the military is becoming heavily politicized, a lot of people think that it's too political even to comment on that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, which has to do with fear, is that, the Secretary of Defense or the President can call any retired officer back to active service and then demote or court-martial him. Now, a court-martial, that would require a military
Oh.
trial and so forth, but a demotion would just be taking it to a board of promotion, which could be appointed entirely by the Secretary of Defense. You lose if you have a star or two taken away off your epaulet, you lose benefits, you
Mm-hmm.
lose, all kinds of things.
So you mean
And
if
look what he's doing to Senator Kelly. They are going after Kelly in particular because he is retired military who could be called back and have that done with him. And it sends a message. Now, I still am shocked that more people aren't speaking out about this. In fact, this is a thing, just to broaden the conversation for a minute, that stuns me the most about Trump. Not so much as what he is saying or doing, although he's saying or doing a lot more swiftly than I had ever anticipated, but the dearth of resistance to this. The fact that, you can't get more than 3 Republican senators or congressmen to vote against something so outrageous. You can't get more than a handful of people in or out to speak out against this. That to me, that's the dismaying thing about all
Mhm,
this. I
mhm,
would have thought, and it certainly would have happened. Look what happened Trump is going way beyond anything that Nixon did. And,
mhm,
with Nixon, 5 Republicans from the Senate went to the White House and said, you've got to go. Now, he was about to get impeached, so that was a little different situation. But this is one of the most distressing things about what's going on, that there's supposed to be all these checks and balances.
mhm,
And one of the checks and balances you would think would be just the conscience
mhm.
of people. There are a lot of Republicans and a lot of military people who know that this is just not right, you know,
Yeah.
to state it mildly. And they're not doing or saying anything about it. Again, the lower and medium courts are doing a good job at holding up the guardrails, but the political culture, what our political culture is supposed to be, is really, failing.
The complicity, the enabling by Republicans of Trump has now gone on for a very long time,
Yeah.
including, during his 4 years out of office. And I think then, while I was doing Trumpcast in the first term, asked Adam Schiff this question. Democrats and even some Republicans love to say that, well, behind closed doors, these guys are full of pepper and, they are so critical of Trump. And if nobody knew who was voting, they'd all vote to impeach him. And then they never speak up. And I asked Schiff, why? Why do you think? And he said that they are afraid of mean tweets.
Afraid
And
of mean tweets.
mean tweets. They are afraid that Trump will savage them on what was then Twitter.
Yeah.
So I was, of course, furious that they couldn't stand that. I haven't been trolled by Trump, but I've been trolled by Tucker Carlson, and it does set off cascading death threats from the followers.
Well, see, that's the thing.
It's not right. It's not easy. But now he doesn't just call you little Bob Corker with your idiot ways or say stuff meant to bring you in line. He says
Yeah.
what he said to the Democrats, including Kelly, who made a video simply reiterating that disobeying unlawful orders is not just an option but an obligation in the military, quoting the Constitution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those people were then threatened very clearly with execution for
Yeah.
treason
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
the president of the United States, where this is not a person, a reply guy in the comments. This is a person for whom speech is not I think a linguist once said speech is not constitutive. It doesn't describe the world. It's a speech act. It is an act of getting something done, putting that
Hmm.
person in the sights of his followers.
Yeah.
And that means death threats. That means an FBI detail. Who knows what Mark Kelly is going through right now, but it's not done in a news cycle once someone is in the sights of the president. And I
Yeah.
think that is what the Republicans are afraid of.
At least in the old days, even if you disagreed with somebody, you were there to kind of get things done.
Yeah.
Now, most Republicans are there just to blow shit up. They whatever power they had, they've surrendered to Trump. Why do they want these jobs?
Yeah.
It puzzles me.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when you describe the squash playing and the glad handing and the applause for the other side and the gentlemanly old ways, because obviously that was galling in its own way, at least
Yeah.
to the American people who, like, I think that is, that's the kind of thing that ladders up to like Epsteinism, right? Where like Noam
Mhm.
Chomsky and Steve Bannon are fighting in public and seem very principled in public and are trading girls or at least money and barbs and quips and whatever in email with some of the worst people on earth, and thus making themselves among, or at least, or maybe they become some of the worst people on earth. So that gentlemanly time where it was maybe more fun to work on the Hill, it doesn't seem like it's going to come back anytime soon. At the
Yeah.
same time, if you listen, and I don't want to go so far as to call this a glimmer of hope, but a friend of mine from high school, I wrote about this, longtime MAGA, who is often in the comments on my Substack telling me what an idiot I am and how dumb Kamala Harris is, all of a sudden wrote and said, I've turned in my card. I'm not a Republican anymore. And one of the reasons was the bellicosity toward Venezuela, toward all these other
Mhm.
countries, the kind of weird promises, the general interventionism, support for Israel, support, in his case, he objects to support for Ukraine, but also what he did to Kelly and the other Democratic veterans who said this thing about unconstitutional orders. That hit him
Mm.
hard. And then you hear the Marjorie Taylor Greenes dissenting, especially on intervention, especially
Mhm.
on an activist foreign policy, let alone a reckless one like we have from Trump. And then the whole slate of other things. It's surprising how many Republicans have been open about Trump's, terrible attack on Rob Reiner when he died,
Yeah. Yeah. That's
and essentially, like, implication that he deserved it. So it
yeah.
could be that the people, the constituents, are saying to the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world and other Congress people who did not work during the shutdown, now
Mhm.
the Trump default, but the long shutdown, they weren't doing anything for the people. They weren't extending ACA benefits, which now some Republicans want to do. And it could be that they're less afraid of those primaries from political hacks from the far right and more afraid of simply losing the faith of
Yeah.
the people. Trump is incredibly unpopular. So you see, particularly on your beat on national security, the people asserting their conscience in some ways, trying to pay some kind of attention to what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in
Mhm.
Ukraine and Russia, and now what's going on in South America, and just say, we thought that you were for the common man, Donald Trump. We went to your
Yeah.
rallies. This is not for the common man.
Well, foreign policy very rarely decides national elections. But in this case, and as you were suggesting, that there are these converging factions of MAGA which are splitting apart. One of them, part of MAGA, took the America First thing literally and said, we don't want any part of anything going on in the world,
That's
whether
right.
we should be or not. They don't know, these people don't want to go to war in Venezuela. I mean, they don't, whether it's bombing, sending troops, or blockading, they don't want any part of it. It hasn't been explained to them. Even if there is a good reason for doing this, it hasn't been explained to them. And then, he's making the same mistake that Biden make, which is, the economy, prices are going up. And in Trump's case, unemployment's going up too. and Trump is denying that it exists, saying, no, 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 affordability, that's a made up
Democratic
issue.
hoax.
Prices are coming down.
Yeah.
And, one thing that people do know, they might not know the ins and outs of Venezuelan oil tankers, but they go to the grocery and they see whether prices are coming up or down. They go to the
Mhm.
gas tank, they see whether price. So if there's this convergence, and who presidents get blamed, rightly or wrongly,
Mhm.
for macroeconomic performance like this.
Mhm.
So yeah, the combination of Trump not looking very America first and prices going up and unemployment going up and whole vast section, people who are getting hit by the tariffs, small business, farmers who were otherwise in favor of him. Yeah, it could be. And then once people on the Hill, Republicans, say, well, it might actually hurt me if I keep
Mhm.
going along with this guy.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we have another year to go before the midterms. And I mean, it's hard to believe that Trump 2.0 has only been here for not even a year. I mean, one thing, I mean, it does show you, there's a school of political science which says doesn't matter who the president is, it's all structure.
Yeah.
He has shown what a president can do and
That's right.
undo
Yep.
just on his own.
Yeah.
I mean, it's astonishing, really, how much executive power was there for him to seize.
Yeah.
It had always been there. Most presidents hadn't used it.
Yep.
This guy did, and oh my God, I mean, I wouldn't have thought that he could undo so much in a country that as he has done. So we have more than twice as much time to go before the midterms, and he could at some point driving the country in the ground becomes something that's palpable
Mhm.
and universally unpopular. I mean, it's
It
one thing to say,
Yeah.
let's get rid of foreign aid and let's get rid of this, but getting rid of cancer research,
Yeah.
getting rid of, pick your favorite, having your healthcare premiums go up triple and your
Mhm.
benefits get cut in half. I mean, people notice this.
Yeah.
This
Yep.
affects everybody.
Yep.
So, in that sense, the foreign policy failures or perception of failures or overextensions feed into, an increasingly dismaying narrative about the guy.
So, just to focus on Venezuela again as a
Mhm.
case study, I think you've named almost maybe 4 reasons that Trump let's leave out his utter madness, which is probably the Trump card for everything he does.
Yeah.
But 4 reasons for what he's doing there. One, which I think we think is false, is that he wants to do what the Condoleezza Rice might have wanted to do in South America, which is depose a tyrant in the form of Maduro to make the world safe for democracy. That does not seem to be
I don't think
anyone's
that's his big
interest
thing. I don't think
in the
that's his big
Republican
thing.
Party.
No.
But that would have been the fig leaf for
Yeah.
really interventionist administrations like George Bush's. So let's go to the real ones. He might be interested in stopping fentanyl from coming into this country on the grounds that things like the fentanyl epidemic or these overdoses are important to
Mhm.
prevent for the base and for Republican Congresspeople and might strengthen his support if he could actually bring those numbers down. He does not seem to be bringing those numbers down by shooting down probably not especially harmful speedboats that are not responsible for the epidemic. But anyway, that's possibly one of the reasons.
Mhm.
Another one has to do with oil.
Yeah.
So the thing that cynics have always said about American adventuring, which is that it's all about oil. So I want you to touch on that one because I think we pretty clear that the Venezuela violence is not it's not cheering up Marjorie Taylor Greene about fentanyl. So I want you to talk a little bit about oil and then also about how this is an entirely executive operation. So unlike Ukraine and Israel doesn't require anything from Congress for him to just keep shooting down ships. This can be worked out on a signal chat and attended by Jeffrey Goldberg and just be war games among some of the weirdest and worst people whose names we all know.
Well, some people think Congress needs to be involved, but,
I mean,
you know
Congress obviously should be, but they're not voting on aid.
yeah, that's right. These
in
are
the
cheap
same way.
operations. You don't need a $1 trillion defense budget to do this sort of thing. Oil is
So
oil is a big obviously, look, I mean, as I said earlier, Venezuela has some of the largest oil reserves anywhere, and very little of it is getting tapped. And this isn't just a matter for oil companies to consider, it's for the Venezuelan people. Like 80% of their income comes from oil exports, and they're excavating a small fraction of what they can have. This is what their economy runs on. And so, yeah, there's tremendous interest in getting at these oil reserves
mhm,
because they're not doing it themselves, and the Cubans aren't helping them do it, and the Russians aren't helping them do it. So it's a very, very big thing. Now, I mean, you can make a legitimate case for that, maybe, but he's doing the exact opposite. When they seized the oil tanker, which, by the way, that tanker had been under sanctions by Biden as far back as 2022. It's another matter
hmm,
to go spelunking on the deck from the helicopter and seizing it with military forces. But somebody asked Trump, "What's going to happen to the oil in that tanker?" And he
mhm,
goes, "I guess we'll keep it." Well, I mean, no, that's not what should happen to the oil. First, he
yeah,
said, "I guess." I mean, it's like he doesn't know. Has he ever not even thought
just
about this?
piracy,
But
right.
second, by saying that, it makes us look like pirates.
Yeah,
Yeah, oh, yeah, the big thing against American policy is, oh, it's all because it's all of the oil. Well, not always, but in this, he's saying, yeah, yeah, it's all about the oil.
we're looting, but, people who run hedge funds that ground in oil and gas
Yeah,
are at least not favorites among the American people, let's
right,
put it that way.
right.
But are people like him donors? What is this class that Trump might be hoping to cater to?
I mean, it's really not terribly political.
Okay. Yeah.
It's about making money. And here,
Right.
if you're into oil and gas and possible revenues and looking at reserves and whether you can excavate them, I mean, Venezuela it's a big neon sign flashing across the water. I mean,
Yeah.
there
I mean,
is so much to be
yeah.
made.
I guess what I'm thinking about, thinking domestically about politics, it doesn't seem as though Trump's the 38, 40% of people who still support Trump um, uh, worry too much about his ego flexing and his madness. But they might worry about him lining the pockets of billionaires. So yeah, so maybe say something about the donors, or at least David Ellison, who now runs Paramount,
Yeah.
got a sweetheart deal from Trump. He's a big Democratic donor, so it doesn't quite matter that they're donors to the party, but that they're cozy enough with Trump that they might get a path cleared for him in Venezuela.
It's interesting, the donor class, which used to consist a lot of industrial
Yeah,
types and oil companies, it's now tech
yeah,
and media.
yeah, yep.
I don't see the overlap in
Okay,
this.
all right, all right. So we don't have a Halliburton style
It is
case
worth
here.
noting that with all the talk of MAGA, and I don't have the exact numbers at hand, but something like 90% of the
Mm-hmm.
people who have voted for Trump in both elections are traditional Republicans
Mm-hmm.
who want lower taxes,
Mm-hmm.
less regulation, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this would include, the heads of big oil companies, which want, above all, taxes and
Right.
less regulation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's still, I mean, we can sometimes overstate the cultural war that's going on, although we feel that a lot in everyday
Mm.
life. But the political parties are still, the composition of who's voting for them, the vast majority of it is as it has been for quite a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I see that, but I think that, and I don't want to relentlessly draw us back to the vortex of Israel, but in some of the splitting with Trump in the base. So let's call it the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Marjorie Taylor Greene faction, the Nick Fuentes faction, the very far right, or the populists. And I think maybe Green falls more into that category. They There are certain parts of the Republican and Democratic platform, including support for Israel, that are inspired by interests that are just not regularly shared by Americans. So they don't understand, for example, any kind of neocon rationale for stabilizing the Middle East.
Hmm.
Israel is not looking much like a democracy anymore, so making the world safe for democracy or supporting a democratic ally in the region is not very binding. But these were all very heady arguments to begin with.
Yeah.
Mostly you have Christian Zionists who believe that this is a fulfillment of some divine prophecy to have the state of Israel. And you have a very small but powerful faction of very wealthy Jews who are committed to traditional Zionism, to the security of the state. None of that is consistent with what you're saying traditional Republicans believe in the sense
Yeah.
of low taxes and deregulation. These are either kind of metaphysical projects by people who have weird ideas about the state of Israel or kind of niche interests by very rich donors in the security of one particular state in the Middle East. And if those things, like the Venezuela project, and maybe even like support for Ukraine, are define the Trump administration, and and then I really think he'll start losing more people, more supporters.
Well, look, a lot of U.S. interests, as defined by presidents and people in Congress in the Middle East, have long had to do with oil. And one would have thought that this would diminish as the U.S. becomes an oil exporter.
Right.
If Saudi Arabia just cut us off tomorrow, we'd get along, which wasn't the case 30 years ago.
That's right. And it was a lot of Biden initiative, right? Like
Yep,
after,
yep.
yep,
Yeah, no, Biden put us over the top in terms of becoming an oil exporter or an energy exporter. But Trump is turned on by the Saudis. He's turned on by the Qataris. He likes hanging out with them. He likes strong men. He has this kind of envy of
mm,
strong dictatorial people.
hmm,
They get bowed to. They don't have to deal with democratic institutions. I mean,
right.
I think a lot of his warming up to Putin and Kim Jong Un and so forth is an envy
Yeah.
of this kind of absolute power. I mean, look, we have a security arrangement with Qatar now that is, I mean, Trump signed a treaty with them that puts us almost like a NATO ally.
Yeah.
Netanyahu's big misstep was when he attacked a Hamas leader who was in Qatar and he bombed a target in Qatar. Trump called him into
Yeah.
the office. He made him call up the head of state to apologize. I don't know if Netanyahu has ever apologized to anybody before. That was kind of the turning point where he forced Netanyahu to sign this ceasefire deal. I
Because
started
he
getting
can't, right? Because he
disgusted
can't
with it.
defend Qatar because he has a relationship with a different dictator based
Yeah,
on bribes. It's just a mob. It's the five families that are dividing up the world.
yeah.
And
You ever notice, by the way, that there are a lot of politicians, Trump is one, Giuliani was another, who say that their favorite movie of all time is The Godfather. I mean, it's
it's
actually one of my favorite
amazing.
movies too. But no,
Yeah,
they dig the whole five family thing and
yeah,
kind of aspire to that.
yeah.
And once you get to a position where you can actually do it to some degree, it becomes very appealing. It becomes almost like a narcotic.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Orwell wrote something about teenage admiration for Al Capone. It's just a small passage, but
Yeah.
in America, where he had obviously ruled about totalitarian states, but totalitarian states are different from mafias. And he thought there was something there was something he didn't couldn't quite fathom in how much certain florid American personalities, and I'm sure he would have considered Trump in this category, like that mob style politics. They don't aspire to a total monopoly on state power,
Right.
totalitarianism. They just want to eat steaks, to have young girls.
Hmm.
That is something that we just don't, and the American Constitution makes very few provisions for this as a human impulse or a tendency. There's so many warnings against tyranny,
Yeah.
but not as many warnings against people forming kind of drug oil gangs and lining their pockets.
Well, they didn't exist back then, but there was, look, a lot of what's in law. Look, if everybody was a decent person, right? You wouldn't need laws.
Right. Yeah.
Laws, you study the laws, like, like there's a bed, like you see signs, no smoking.
Yeah.
That suggests that at one point, or perhaps even now otherwise, a lot of people smoked right here. You don't
Mm-hmm.
need a sign, no smoking,
Mm-hmm.
if people don't smoke. So
Yes.
you have these provisions in the Constitution and in law that guard against tyranny, that guard against foreign influence. I mean, the fact that you have to be a native-born American to run for president,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the fact that there are provisions in the Constitution, foreign influence, very big thing, because it was they didn't want England to come and take over the country again,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, but, even Madison and Hamilton and others warned that, well, sometime down the road, there might be a weird guy who gets through the cracks anyway, and then we've really got to watch out. I mean, there's explicit warnings to this effect
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
Federalist
Yeah. Yeah.
Papers, and we're seeing it now, right?
So, to conclude, and pull the camera back, one of my favorite guests and thinkers is Asla Bali at Yale Law School now, who came on on Trumpcast in 2017 and said out of the gate, the Pax Americana is done, and that was her first read on what Trump's election meant. She was the only person I heard say that, and that we have to start thinking outside it. Do you agree? And we are, 9 years since she said that, and since it started to seem true, what does that mean? I mean, A, do
Hmm.
you agree? And B, what does it mean going forward?
Okay, well, this is a good place to end up because it's very interesting. I don't think it's done,
Okay.
but it's headed in that direction. I mean, for example, the relationship that we have now with Europe, where everybody is constantly, bending over and kissing Trump's hand and his ring and saying how great he is and how much he's done for the world and so on. That's because right now Europe is still very dependent on the United States for its security. I mean, they're moving toward a more autonomous defense force and so forth. I asked somebody in Berlin a couple years ago if all the European countries really got together and said, okay, yeah, now we have to create our own defense force. And yet we're going to start spending the money it takes to do it now. How long would it take to actually get there? The common answer I heard was about 10 years. That's how long it would take.
Mm-hmm.
So they know that for quite a while to come, they still depend on the U.S., and so they have to kowtow. And,
Mm-hmm.
Trump, who was about to pull out of NATO, he goes to a meeting where everybody treats him great, and he comes out saying, hey, this organization's terrific. No, this is because they pretended to like him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So much of the world, same is true with Japan, South Korea, you can go on, still depends on the United States for security. The dollar is still the international currency. The United States could sanction a country and then impose secondary sanctions saying, we're going to sanction you if you deal with this country, and it works. It
Mhm.
largely works. English is still, every pilot of every airplane in the world speaks English because they have to deal with the FAA. So we are still the dominant country in many ways, but in so many other ways, it's going in the other direction. And the thing that worries me is that once, whether it's 5 years from now, 10, whatever, once Europe can go its own way, once a lot of other countries go its own way, once, I don't know, the euro and Chinese currency start being used a lot more in international transactions, there's going to be so much bitterness and resentment built up of the subjugations that these countries have made toward the United States over the decades that we are going to get screwed. So if that's what your guest was saying, we're headed in that direction.
Yes,
and
I think that
I don't
was
know how
it.
we pull back from it, by the way. It's where
Yep.
we're going.
Well, Trump may have cultivated the appearance of power at a great cost to actual American power.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll see. Fred, thank you so much. This has been so clarifying. I will stand on a subway platform with you as long as it takes to get to the F train, if you can keep informing me this way. It is so, so good always to hear from you. So thanks for being here.
Same here. Same here.
That's it for today's show. This episode is dedicated to the memory of Rob Reiner. What Rough Beast is produced by Richard Stanislaw. Brianna Snyder helped edit the show, and John Jeremiah Sullivan recorded our theme song Je dis que je pense et je vis comme je veux, which was originally recorded and written by the French pop star Antoine. Please subscribe to the show at vpheffernan.com or whatroughbeastpod.com or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Virginia Heffernan. On behalf of the What Rough Beast team, thank you so much for listening and watching. We'll see you next time on What Rough Beast. See ya on the flip side. Okay, we're just waiting for the F train. That's what we do.